Welcome back. Today, we're opening one of England's oldest cold cases. Two royal children, heirs to the throne, were sent to the Tower of London in 1483. They were never seen again. No bodies, no trials, just silence. This is the case of the princes in the tower. A mystery more than 5 centuries old, still debated by historians, still surrounded by shadows. To understand how two boys, Edward and Richard, could disappear under royal watch, we have to look at the storm that brought them there. Because this wasn't just a case of missing persons. This was power, politics, and a kingdom at war with itself. England in the 15th century was caught in a dynastic war known as the Wars of the Roses, a brutal conflict between two branches of the Plantagenet family, the Yorks and the Lancasters. Each believed they had the stronger claim to the throne. The result was a decades-long struggle that reshaped the monarchy. By the early 1460s, Edward of York had seized the throne, becoming Edward IV. He was charismatic, militarily gifted, and ambitious. His rise came at the cost of heavy bloodshed, but he managed to bring relative stability for a time. Edward's reign was not without controversy. He married Elizabeth Woodville, a widow from a lesser noble family, an unusual choice for a king. Their union upset many within the nobility, especially those who saw the Woodvilles as opportunists. Despite tensions, Edward and Elizabeth had several children, including two sons, Edward, born in 1470, and Richard, born in 1473. These boys were legitimate heirs, symbols of Yorkist continuity. Edward's younger brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was a loyal supporter of the crown. Known for his military prowess and administrative skill, Richard earned respect in both the north and at court. Then, in April of 1483, everything changed. King Edward IV died suddenly at the age of 40. His death was unexpected. His eldest son, Edward, was just 12 years old. That's where our story truly begins. Edward and Richard were born into privilege, but also into a deeply unstable time. As the sons of a king, they carried the weight of the Yorkist claim. Young Edward was titled Prince of Wales, and Richard became Duke of York. They were groomed from birth for roles that were both ceremonial and strategic. Edward, the older of the two, was reportedly intelligent and precocious. He had been living in Ludlow, under the care of his maternal uncle Anthony Woodville, when his father died. Almost immediately, plans were set in motion to bring Edward to London for his coronation. Richard, the younger brother, was just 9 years old. He remained with his mother in sanctuary at Westminster Abbey. Their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, knew how quickly court politics could turn lethal. She had seen it happen before. In May of 1483, Edward entered London with a small entourage, expecting to be crowned king. He was housed in the Tower of London, a customary place for monarchs in waiting, not yet a prison. Richard would join him there soon after. At first, their stay didn't raise suspicions. The tower served as both fortress and royal residence. But as the days stretched into weeks, the coronation was delayed. Council meetings became secretive. And then came the announcement: Edward would not be crowned. Instead, his uncle Richard would assume the throne. In Edward's will, if such a document truly existed, he supposedly named his brother Richard as Lord Protector. This role gave Richard authority to govern on behalf of the young king until he came of age. But how Richard interpreted that role would soon change everything. Richard arrived in London from the north, accompanied by a strong retinue. Within days, he ordered the arrest of Anthony Woodville and several of Edward's closest allies. One of them, Lord Hastings, was executed without trial. The justification? Treason. The real motive? A consolidation of power. Richard presented his moves as protection for the realm, preventing the influence of the Woodville family, whom many in court distrusted. But this swift and decisive action sent shockwaves. England had seen protectorates before, but none had looked quite like this. By early June, both young princes were in the Tower of London. Publicly, it was still believed Edward would be crowned. But then a sermon was delivered at St. Paul's Cathedral claiming Edward and his siblings were illegitimate, born while Edward IV was supposedly pre-contracted to marry another woman. Shortly after, Parliament passed a document called the Titulus Regius, which legally declared the children of Edward IV illegitimate. This cleared the path for Richard to be crowned Richard III. The coronation took place on July 6, 1483. It was official. Richard was king. The Tower of London, wasn't just a prison. It was a fortress, an arsenal, a royal residence, and at times a symbol of political fate. For centuries, monarchs had stayed there before their coronations. The presence of young Edward and Richard within its walls didn't initially alarm the public. But over time, things changed. By the late summer of 1483, public sightings of the boys had stopped. No parades, no ceremonies, no glimpses from tower windows. The princes had disappeared from view. Contemporaries took notice. Chroniclers began to record whispers that something was wrong. Foreign ambassadors sent curious reports home. Rumors spread, but no explanations were given. The crown remained silent. Some reports suggested the boys were seen playing in the gardens of the tower in early summer. But as the months passed, even those sightings ceased. Eventually, the rumors turned darker. Why were they still in the tower? Were they being kept safe or being silenced? The lack of transparency only deepened suspicion. Richard III's regime, already founded on shaky legitimacy, began to face pressure. Rebel uprisings grew. Loyalty waned. And still, nothing was said of the princes. Richard III's ascent to the throne was swift, but not smooth. From the moment of his coronation, doubts clung to him. Supporters praised him as a capable ruler, determined to restore order. But critics saw a usurper who had taken the throne by discrediting his own nephews. The Titulus Regius, the document that legitimized Richard's claim, was distributed widely, but it failed to win over many hearts, especially in the South, where loyalty to Edward IV's memory remained strong. Meanwhile, the mystery of the missing princes deepened. Their continued absence became a silent accusation. No official statement, no funeral, no bodies, just a growing sense of unease. Whispers turned into speculation. Had Richard ordered their deaths? Were they moved elsewhere in secret? Or were they simply collateral in a much larger game of power? By the end of 1483, the silence around the princes had become deafening. Richard's efforts to secure his reign, through rewards to loyalists and crackdowns on dissent, only fueled the suspicion that something terrible had been done and deliberately covered up. It was a reign haunted from its beginning. The disappearance of Edward and Richard remains one of the most haunting mysteries in British royal history. For centuries, people have asked the same chilling question: what happened to the princes in the tower? Contemporary sources provide only fragments. No witnesses ever came forward with first-hand accounts. No official inquiry was made. And the crown, under Richard III, never acknowledged their absence. What followed instead were generations of speculation, rumor, and theory. One theory, and perhaps the most widely accepted, is that the boys were murdered, most likely smothered in their sleep. The prime suspect has long been Richard III. As the man who stood to benefit most from their deaths, the logic of motive is simple. With the boys gone, no rival Yorkist claims could challenge him. Yet Richard's guilt is far from proven. Some historians argue that it would have been politically reckless for Richard to murder the princes so early in his reign. If discovered, the backlash would be catastrophic. And indeed, Richard ruled for over 2 years, time during which no definitive evidence of the prince's fate emerged. Others have pointed to the Duke of Buckingham, once a close ally of Richard's, later a rebel, as a possible perpetrator. Buckingham may have acted without Richard's knowledge, seeking favor or aiming to control events himself. But there is no clear evidence tying him to the crime. Then there's Henry Tudor, later Henry VII. He became king after defeating Richard at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. Some theories suggest that Henry, upon taking the throne, may have had the boys killed if they were still alive, viewing them as threats to his new regime. But again, there's no solid proof. What we're left with are plausible suspects, political motives, and circumstantial cases. No smoking gun, no confessions, just the grim reality that 2 children vanished, and nobody was ever held accountable. In 1674, nearly 2 centuries after the princes vanished, workmen repairing a staircase in the Tower of London made a chilling discovery: a wooden chest containing 2 small skeletons buried under a staircase near the White Tower. The bones were found during the reign of Charles II and were widely believed to be those of the missing princes. The king ordered them to be placed in Westminster Abbey, in a white marble urn near the tomb of Edward the Confessor. An inscription on the urn identifies them as Edward V and Richard, Duke of York. But the identification was based on assumption. No forensic analysis existed at the time, and the tower had long been used as a place of execution and imprisonment, meaning those remains could have belonged to others. In 1933, the urn was opened and examined by a group of anatomists. They concluded that the bones likely belonged to two children aged roughly the same as Edward and Richard. However, modern standards for forensic science were not yet in use, and the conclusions remain inconclusive. Calls have been made in recent decades to re-examine the bones using DNA testing, but royal permissions have consistently been denied. Without further study, the true identity of the skeletons and their cause of death remains uncertain. So we are left, again, in shadow. The bones may belong to the princes, or they may not. They may have been murdered, or they may have died of illness, injury, or something else entirely. All we know for certain is that 2 lives were lost, and history closed its doors too quickly. Over the centuries, Richard III's legacy has swung like a pendulum. Long painted as a villain, thanks largely to Shakespeare and Tudor propaganda, modern historians have challenged the image of a power-hungry child killer. The discovery of Richard's remains in a Leicester parking lot in 2012 sparked renewed interest. Far from a monstrous hunchback, forensic analysis revealed a man with scoliosis but no physical deformity matching the Tudor myths. His reburial in Leicester Cathedral drew global attention. Historians and biographers have since re-examined the evidence against him. Some argue that Richard was a reformer, concerned with justice and administration, whose short reign was unfairly defined by a mystery that may not have been his doing. This reappraisal has led to growing support for re-investigating the bones interred in Westminster Abbey. Advances in DNA testing and forensic anthropology could potentially confirm or disprove the identity of the remains. With modern science, we could finally answer the question, are these the missing princes? Yet, efforts to gain access have consistently been denied. The Abbey and the Crown have resisted disturbing the remains, citing respect for the dead and a lack of compelling reason. For now, the bones remain undisturbed and the mystery unsolved. Still, the story captures us, because at its core, it's not just about politics or power. It's about 2 boys trapped in the machinery of monarchy and the long shadow of silence that followed them. And until the doors of science are stayed open fully, that shadow will remain.